So here comes the highlight of week 1, and one of the highlights of the whole course, the argument from Massive Reduplication. This is an argument in favour of accepting Russell's principle of acquaintance. Let's see if you think the argument's convincing. Now I want to start by telling you about a failure to think. So I'm not giving you the argument yet, that's going to come later. I want to tell you about a failure to think. So next door to me live some musicians, and I have to tell you, I've never actually met these musicians, I've never seen them. They keep quite different hours to those of Mrs. B and I, disreputable hours I might even say. And you know, every now and again we hear the usual kind of bumps, crashes and whatever kind of noise that I suppose these musicians are creating. So we know these musicians really only through the sound. We know the musicians only through the sound. Gosh. Right on cue. I mean, they're up early today. It's already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You don't really hear them this time. I'm just going to close the window. Okay, good. Now, it should be a bit quieter in here now. I hope you're not going to hear too much of them. Anyway, but you get the idea. So we hear these people, but we don't know anything other of them. And so this morning I said to Mrs. B, I said, the vocalist is doing better today than she was yesterday. I'm not saying a lot there, but you know, she is improving. And Mrs. B said, yes, but it sounds like the drummer is all over the place again. Now on the face of it, you know, here we are talking about the vocalist and the drummer, 2 people who live next door to us, our neighbours. Now we don't say we get on fabulously with them, but we seem to be having thoughts about them. We're thinking about our neighbours, or are we? Well, it turns out, here's the interesting revelation. We just discovered that actually it isn't a band of musicians, it's a collective that has rotating members. So the vocalist that we were hearing today, when I made that remark here, she's not long gone, she's different from the vocalist who was here yesterday, who's now long gone. It's a rotating collective. And likewise for the drummer, there's a whole sequence of different drummers. Sometimes there are 2 drummers. We had no idea. So here I think you could rightly say there is a failure of us to think. It seemed like when I said to Mrs. B, the vocalist is doing better today than she was yesterday, that I was expressing a thought about a particular person. But what was I really thinking about? There is no vocalist, right? There are many vocalists. The vocalist yesterday is different from the vocalist today. So what I've said just doesn't really fit, and it seems that what I was trying to express wasn't a thought about anything. It wasn't a thought about today's vocalist, because today's vocalist isn't doing better than she was yesterday. It wasn't a thought about yesterday's vocalist. It wasn't a thought about both of them, because I'm clearly trying to contrast one person. Just a thought about nobody. Likewise, when Mrs. B was talking about the drummer, she wasn't thinking about anything. Right? There was nothing that she was thinking about. So here we have a failure of thought. Interesting lesson. If your knowledge of the things that you're thinking about is what Russell calls knowledge by description, you are not acquainted with the things, you've never met the neighbours like us because they keep different hours, you only know them by description, then it may well be that although you believe you're thinking about something, it turns out later that you're not thinking about anything at all. Nice. Okay? So this is very important. So far I've explained it's possible to have the illusion of thought without actually thinking about anything at all. I thought I was thinking about someone, the vocalist, and I wasn't. I wasn't thinking about anything at all. So when we rely on knowledge by description, we are always at risk of not thinking about anything. That risk is always there. Now, we need to be very careful here. What I've suggested so far is kind of an isolated problem, and it involves an unusual and highly contrived situation. It's very fortunate that my neighbours, they have all kinds of downsides living next to these musicians, but they do provide good anecdotes. Thank you, neighbours. I don't know if they'll ever watch this one day. I'm not going to listen to their music. I'm sure they're not going to watch my philosophy lectures. But you never know. You never know. It's important to get on with your neighbours, isn't it? Why am I telling you this? You don't need to know this. What you need to know is that what I've described so far is an isolated problem, so we're not going to take this too seriously, right? And certainly we wouldn't be involved in some kind of terrible travesty of mistaken inference, like thinking, on any given occasion it's possible that I'm wrong, therefore it's possible that I'm invariably wrong. Right? that doesn't follow at all. People do this all the time in sort of trying to construct skeptical arguments, and it's invariably a mistake. This argumentative structure is very bad. No, don't do that. Naughty. Okay, so why do we care? Well, what we need to do is to find some way of getting from my anecdote to a larger scale possibility that doesn't involve making a bad inference. And this is where the possibility of massive reduplication comes into the picture. The possibility of massive reduplication is the possibility that, for all we know, there may be a distant region of the universe with duplicates of everything around here. Right. There may be a distant region of the universe that contains duplicates of everything around here. So here I am, just now recording this lecture, and in the distant faraway universe, part of the universe, there is my counterpart, and sure enough he's also male, he's just like me, he's wearing the same jacket, he's got these rather nice glasses I'm very fond of, although they're quite broken now, and so on, and you get the idea, you know, and he's also married to somebody called Mrs. B, who looks just like Mrs. B, and so on and so forth. The possibility exists that there is some part of the universe in which everything around here is duplicated very, very exactly. All stuff looks just the same, and that, you know, that could be true for all we know. Right? I don't think it is true, but it might be. Can't rule it out. Okay, why is that relevant? Well, it gives us an argument. Suppose that you were not acquainted with anything at all. Right? Suppose that you thought Russell's idea about acquaintance are just a myth. There is nothing which is more primitive than thought, and which connects our thoughts to the world. We'll see some views like this later in the course, next week, if you're following the lectures in order. So there are people who think, look, acquaintance is a myth, you're not acquainted with anything at all. Now let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that they're right. It would follow that all of your thoughts would be based on knowledge by description. It's those descriptions that connect your thoughts to the world. But in that case, we also have to allow that massive reduplication is possible, for all we know. And then it would follow that you might not be thinking about anything at all, for all we know. So you might be in a situation, not just like me, where what I thought was a vocalist next door is actually a series of people who are coming and going, part of this musical collective. But that actually everything that you're thinking about, all of the stuff that you know by description, you're not really singling out anything with those descriptions, because the descriptions apply equally well to some other stuff in a faraway part of the universe. So you see how we got here. We've taken the idea that your thoughts all rest on knowledge by description, no acquaintance allowed, together with the idea that massive reduplication is possible, and we've got to this conclusion that you might not ever be thinking about anything at all. Seems to follow. But we do know, I take it, that you sometimes succeed in thinking about some things. Now, you'd have to be a pretty serious skeptic to think that this is false. Right? Generally speaking, skeptics tend to doubt the existence of things in the external world. Right? So if you're a skeptic about cats, you don't think that cats exist. If you're a skeptic about physical objects, you think there are no physical objects. But here you would be a skeptic about the contents of your own mind. Now that's possible, perhaps even more plausible than skepticism about the external world. Perhaps it's actually more plausible to be skeptical about the mind. We'll think about that later. But even an extreme form of skepticism, I think, wouldn't embrace this idea. Wouldn't reject this idea. Right? Even an extreme skeptic should embrace this idea that we do know that sometimes we succeed about thinking about some things. Yes, there are cases where we think we're thinking about things and we're not, but that's not the general rule. It follows from all of this then, this is my last point, 6 here, that we are acquainted with at least one thing. How does that follow? Here I've derived a contradiction. I've got 4 and 5. This is my contradiction. 4 follows from 2 and 3. 5, I've just tried to persuade you, is widely accepted, and you should probably accept it too. So I've got a contradiction, so what I'm going to do is use that contradiction to reject the first premise here, right? Because what I've done is I've supposed that that were true, that you're not acquainted with anything at all. I've derived the contradiction 4 to 5, and so I'm using what you'll later come to talk of as, I think, negation elimination, but don't trust me on that. Or is it contradiction elimination? I forget. You'll have to think about this when you're in logic. Anyway, forgive me. What I've done is I've derived a contradiction from the supposition, and therefore I reject the supposition. I think that you're acquainted with at least one thing. See how that argument works? Now, I'm not saying for a moment that this argument is conclusive. I think that many of you may have interesting objections to this argument. You may even have straightforward objections to this argument. But I think it's an argument that's worth thinking carefully about. This is the argument from the possibility of massive reduplication to the conclusion that Russell's principle of acquaintance is right, or something very like it. You're acquainted with at least one thing. So I'm suggesting that the possibility of massive reduplication provides us with an argument for Russell's principle. Now that's not very careful. If I was being much more careful here, what I'd be saying is it provides us with an argument for something close to Russell's principle. After all, Russell's principle doesn't say what we've just concluded. Let's go back a second. Yeah, that's right. Let's go back a second. Here's what we've just concluded. You're acquainted with at least one thing. Now, of course, that's not quite Russell's principle. That could be true and Russell's principle could be false. Because if you remember, Russell's principle of acquaintance says that every proposition which we can understand is composed wholly of constituents with which we're acquainted. Or maybe you've chosen another way that Russell formulates the principle. And there Russell says, all of our knowledge of truths rests on, fundamentally, on acquaintance. So what we have here, I take it, is an argument that doesn't quite give us Russell's principle, but it gives us something close to Russell's principle. It gives us an argument for the idea that acquaintance is a necessary part of our connection to the world. Without acquaintance, according to the argument, our thoughts would not be connected to the world at all. And it will not be a big step from that.